We live now. Madupe, I want to just say Madupe for those that's tuning in to the Mossi Warrior Clan. Madupe to those that may tune in later. Madupe for those that may come into the archives and check out the video in archives. I want to say Fatmo Alafie, Fatmo Iwa Pele, Spears of Flying and Pseudos of Crime. All right, go ahead, Sunshine. Take it off.
I appreciate it. I see a couple people, man, and I already got in. So please feel free to like and share the video. Subscribe to the channel and also subscribe. Well, go like our Facebook page. I appreciate everybody who's tuned in today, those who may just straggle in a minute, and those who uh, haven't noticed or noticed the notification just yet, but we're about to get it in. And I just want to say peace to Lisa, Jadair, Cedric, and Jennifer out of Pittsburgh. All right, much love, sis. And ETM Hotel to anyone else that's straggling in. But we're going to dive right into the presentation. I don't want to hold people up today. As people file in, like Kofi always say, we want to practice good character. So, let's be respectful in the chat. If there's some questions or anything, we'll try to get to those questions at some point, whether it be the end or addressing it on the spot. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'll wait till it can be seen on the other side. And we'll get right into it. Straight like that. Yeah. Okay, so I see that it can be seen on this side. We're gonna go ahead and jump right into it. Again, based on the title of this particular presentation, it is called Isowo ni ile awon alawodudu. I pronounced it correctly. Correct me. My Yoruba speaking skills is kind of odd. Now, why would I name it that? For one, I was going to go with a different name, but I decided not to use an English term to title this particular presentation, and I decided to not use the Muslim term to title this particular presentation. I went with the Yoruba term, and the closest translation to the term for the title of this particular presentation. So for our Yoruba speaking family who may translate this a different way, I only did this because it was the closest translation to what we were trying to title the presentation. And so let's get to it, man. I mean, we here, right? So we're going to jump right on in this thing. And everybody can see my screen on Facebook, I believe. All right, let's go. So I want to shout out to Saber Wujawu for making that. He did an excellent job, and it is our right to protect our elders and our ancestors' work, and we'll stand on their shoulders and defend real scholarship. So here's the title of the presentation. Isowo niile awon alawodudu. Trade in the land of the blacks. In the background, you can hear the market going. In the background, you can hear transactions transpiring. In the background, you can hear business. As many come in and many come out the marketplace. Before colonization, although certain areas like the oil rivers of the Niger Delta traded extensively with other parts of the world, and though there were various levels of trade between different West African peoples and some across the Sahara to North Africa, the economies were dominantly subsistence agriculture economies. And as always, before we kick things off, let's go to war. Let's go to war. Trade, by definition, is the active process of buying, selling, or exchanging commodities at either wholesale or retail within a country or between countries. The business of buying and selling or bartering commodities, or the activities of buying and selling goods and services, especially between countries. Old West Africa possessed two kinds of wealth that were greatly desired by the peoples of the far north and east, whether in Africa or Europe or Asia. These were gold and ivory. Some will argue it's gold and salt. Before 1750, Africa had well-known trading links with the outside world. There were trade networks stretching beyond the continent across the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Atlantic. Over the past 20 years, research has considerably changed the information base available for the study of this subject, and in consequence, nearly all recent work has cast doubt on findings that were taken for granted 2 decades ago. The existence of local trade economy based on the barter of consumer goods are locally locally made products and generally accepted both for Africa and elsewhere very early on, and certainly for our period. Few communities are completely self-supporting. Some have commodities that others lack, so they trade within one another. There may be two neighboring villages. One is by the river full of fish, the other has no river, but is built on clay soil which can be used to make pots. Each has something the other lacks, and inhabitants can make and exchange clay pots for fish. This kind of simple barter trade needs no elaborate organization. The fisherman brings the fish, the potter brings the pots. There is no need for specialized retailers whose profession is to trade. Several villages may be close to one another, each producing commodities which are wanted in the others. Here, instead of direct exchange, the commodities may be brought for barter to one of the villages, perhaps to each village in turn on successive days. This means a market and a regular market day. Here, trade has to be more organized. If the market lasts all day, the fisherman cannot take time off from work, so he sends his wife, who thus becomes part-time trader. This is how trade grew up in the forest belt of coastal West Africa. Small communities, largely but not completely self-supporting, exchanged goods with one another. But there was no need for specialized trading profession, for women could combine trade with their household and family occupations. Some highly valued commodities were made only in a few places, but were in demand over a wide area. Potential customers might be hundreds of miles away from place of manufacture. To supply them, the commodity would have to be transported over a long distance. Such trade we can reasonably call export trade, for the commodity was exported far from the place where it was made. Salt, for instance, which most people find a necessity rather than a luxury, was manufactured on the West African seashore. Seawater was made to flow into the shallow ponds where it evaporated in the heat of the sun, leaving a thick, salty crust on the ground. This deposit was scraped up and purified by mixing with warm water and poured through cone-shaped baskets filled with straw. This strain of the earth, it was then re-dried in the sun. Later, when European goods became available, special shallow pans were imported as dryers. The finished salt was then packed up in baskets to be bartered with the inland peoples who had no way of making it themselves.
Here, the salt mine has been working since the 11th century. In Tau Denis, the landscape changes with the day. A pockmarked landscape of tailings from the hand-dug pits where the salt is mined. The abrasive sand grinds away slowly on the bodies of the men who continue to work the salt. Many have terrible sores all over their feet and hands.
There are days when your arms hurt, but there are no doctors here. There is nothing. There are men who have bad wounds like this. It's really hard, but what are you going to do?
The salt tablets are loaded on the camels as the people prepare to head out. They will spend about 14 days heading south to Timbuktu. For them, crossing the desert is not merely getting from here to there. It is a process. In the Sahara Desert, there is no reference point. As far as the eye can see, it's an absolute sea of sand. Nighttime comes and goes. The sun rises large in the sky. As the caravans move out on these long journeys, the guides utilize skills which have been developed slowly, literally over generations. They read the direction of the stars. They use the orientation of the sand dunes and tracings in the sand that mark the direction of the prevailing winds. As they travel through the desert, they come upon well after well, where the caravans stop and allow their camels to drink. It's the continuation of a tradition, a means of survival that's been alive for 1,000 years. During their trip, the caravan encounters rain, causing them to stop. The rain affects the salt and will cause it to break if it is not allowed to dry out. They are at least a 10 days walk north of Timbuktu, in the middle of the Syrian desert, down to a liter or two of water. But they don't panic. They remain extraordinarily calm. They send a guide to track down a rumored well and hope that the rains have been sufficient. With the little water they have left, they brew some tea. They have learned to adapt to the desert landscape, using the knowledge gained from their ancestors over the centuries. As they get closer to Timbuktu, as far as the eye can see, the sand and the sky blends together. The camel caravans arrive in Timbuktu. They very carefully unload the camels one salt block at a time. They stack the salt blocks in a little adobe courtyard. They prepare to make the journey back to Taudeni, continuing the cycle of the salt caravan.
Cotton imported originally from North Africa grew plentiful on many farms and in compounds, though it was not planted systemically in plantations. In some places, people specialized in weaving it and exporting their woven cloths to regions where they did not weave. Some special cloths were sought after over an enormous area, like the famous Kano cloth. This video was a little extreme. It's about 9 minutes long. Be patient, because there's some valuable information to be learned from the Kano cloth makers. And the reason that I chose to use this particular video is so that we can kind of gain some perspective of what a Kano cloth is and how they make it. So it's an actual process.
Before we even left Lagos, we had obviously made plans to talk to people in Kano and things.
Hello. Salaam alaikum.
Kano was actually quite difficult to communicate because they spoke Hausa mainly. So, but we're lucky to get like our driver who speaks like Hausa, who's from the north, from Nasarawa, to talk to them. So there was quite a lot of like back and forth, talking.
Hello, salaam alaikum.
But it was from Abuja to Kano. You think that because they're almost next to each other, that is short, but it was such long distances. Now we're getting to the big landmass places and stuff. So like everywhere was just long to get to. Like took 3-4 hours to, I think it was like 6 hours drive. We finally got to Kano, and we then called the guy and we were asking him, oh, where should we meet? The only place I knew was the Kufa Mata Dive Pit, so I just Googled it. Google was like our best friend in all our travels. Oh my God, as in, I feel like I need to buy something on Google to just be like, thank you for saving us, because it really helped us. We're waiting for the guy, like I said. But then when we met him and things, we then entered the Kufa Mata Dive Pit, and I was just like, wow, like this is so cool. I met my best friend of the whole, like, of my whole, like, traveling and stuff. Like, he was my guy. And stuff. He's the one that took us around everywhere and things. His name is Haruna.
Organization, and take you around to show you what we are doing.
Thank you.
After I explained in the dive pit and take the room and making design at home. Show you progress of that.
So he took us around. He explained everything as best as he could.
This one, this current one.
Current one.
Yes, this one. under permutation. So tomorrow morning, this one is finished permutation. So tomorrow morning,
Start using it.
Yeah, start using dye. The name of this pattern, which you call House of Parliament. So now Nigeria are practicing democracy, and this is what you call bride and bridegroom design: honesty, hospitality, and friendship.
Friendship.
Yeah, these are the 3 pillars of Kano, and they see the northern symbol of Nigeria.
So Haruna took us to the place where the women like do the tying of the cloth. We then passed where the first person that started the Kufa Mata dye pit lived. Wow.
We call him Malam Muhammad Gabo.
I know exactly what heritage is.
Heritage.
From your father to
Generation to generation. And me as 7th generation.
And he too was born there. And it's like a 7-generational like business, and it's a family family business. And it started in like 1498 or something ridiculous like that, and it's very much still alive. It was really like mind-blowing.
So you are welcome to the Mama house.
I then asked him about like, oh, like the cloth though, where do you make this cloth, like, and stuff. And then he was telling me, oh, there was like, my guy was telling me that it was like, he was saying like it's in the village like 2 hours away from there and stuff. And when I was looking at the time, it was like 2 or 3. I was just like, hi, can we get there? So he's like, I'll take you. We're just like, I don't understand. You're going to take us 2 hours away from here and come back with us. Like, he's like, yeah, no problem. I'll take you. I was just like, okay, this is really weird. Like, I didn't think anybody would do that, but like, thank you. So we went with this guy. The village is called it's Makuda, and I think it's named after the soil or something. Makuda is the soil, and it's so beautiful. So Haruna took us like around the village, and we met like 2-3 people and things, and they were explaining the cloth. And I was just looking at the looms. The looms are so much better. The cloth was light. That was the first time I was just like, oh, thank God, there's lighter cloth. Like finally, because I'm not somebody that likes thick cloth and stuff. So when I saw this like cloth, I was like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. And I do like navy blue. It's like, I like the colors that they use, and the weaving was so much faster, and everything about it was just like, oh my gosh, I don't believe we have this. This is amazing. It's like one like the highlights of my it was Makuda. Like I even recorded this little boy that was doing the rolling of the yarn. It was nice because it's not like child labor or whatever. It was like they even gave him money like when he finishes his work. I like how they're teaching them the value of working hard and stuff like that. Yeah, something cool really happened. That was just like, it was almost like full circle kind of thing. So my mom, she had seen this picture of Zara Buhari when she got married with this regal indigo fabric and things. And my mom was just like, this cloth is really beautiful. If we could find out where to get it and stuff. When we got to that Makuda, Haruna then showed me, my guy showed me the guy that made that cloth for Zara Buhari. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I had to even take a picture with him. And so I was like, like that is crazy. And then I bought some of it for my mom. And so when I came back and I showed my mom, I was just like, oh my gosh, that's like, it's just so interesting that all our research and things really brought us to the core person that even made the cloth. I thought that was really awesome. So we came back to the Kano city, like the main city, 2 hours back again, and Haruna was like, okay, I have to take you somewhere. I have to take you to leather tanning, the tanning place and stuff. I was like, okay, it's not part of our research, but I was like, why not? We should go, definitely. We saw crocodile, we saw snake skin, I was like, this is where Zuchi and stuff like import their things from. They were saying that they export all these things to Europe. They are one of the best tanning places in Africa. The smell of that place is ridiculous. I think that's one of the worst smells that I've ever smelled in my life. Like I was even the best person to take it. Like my team was like, they couldn't stand the smell. They were like, oh my gosh, one of them was spitting, everything. But it was actually for me, it was fascinating. What I like about leather business is that they use everything. So it's not like, oh, they're just cutting it for leather and leaving the meat. They use the meat, they use everything, which is a good thing. It's like still like helping the environment. Part where like he was showing us somebody picking the warp thread. Some guy was just picking it. So I was just thinking like his whole day is just picking because of specialization and stuff. For me, I'm not sure about the quality of his life because he's just picking that every day. I mean,
all right, so that's the end of the actual video. What I did want to elaborate on, as you can see my blank screen, and we'll get back to things, is that the hard work and dedication it takes that goes in to make the candle cloth. As you can see, it can be a very beautiful fabric. This is one method of an export trade that you heard her say that they export these things to all the way to Europe. You saw alligator, snake skin, they were real unique in their work. West Africa is rich in easily workable mineral deposits. The archaeologists who have investigated the node culture of northern Nigeria have proved that iron has been worked here for about 2,000 years. So much for the assertion which one sometimes reads that the inhabitants of West Africa were living in the Stone Age until Europeans arrived. In some places, iron was extracted from the ground surface, and other shafts were tunneled to reach the seams of iron ore. The extracted ore was smelted in furnaces. For a description of this process, see Dennis Wilson, The Iconology of the Yoruba Eden Ogbani, Africa, Volume 24. Number 2, 1964, page 152. That's the source. Smelted iron was then shaped into balls. Iron was an exportable commodity which could be exchanged against other goods, like salt, for instance. For most of the iron deposits were inland, away from the sea. Sometimes it was exported in the form of iron bars for blacksmiths to turn into swords or farming implements. Sometimes it was ready for manufacture by blacksmiths on the spot. Early European visitors praised the quality of the West African ironwork. The great Brazilian historian Gilberto Freire has pointed out that African miners and blacksmiths transported as slaves across the Atlantic were responsible for the mining industry in Brazil. Other industries that produced goods for export were leather making and perhaps soap making. The cattle keeping peoples living on the fringe of the forest belt could export leather goods into the forest country, which was unsuited for rearing cattle, either tan hides manufactured into goods like sandals or shields. Soap was made from palm oil mixed with ashes. The soap manufacture of the Plantain Islands off of Sierra Leone was of such high quality in the 17th century that the Portuguese government are said to have prohibited from being imported into Portugal to compete with the Portuguese soap. The export trade then was based on localized industries. Some industrial works were set apart from the rest of the predominantly farming population. Miners perhaps, and certainly blacksmiths, but in some industries there were no specialized full-time workers. For example, sea salt was made by women or by men too old to farm. Hence, industrial organization did not lead to any widespread division of labor among manual workers. nor was there the gulf between the industrial workers and peasants that more intensive industrialization leads to. Export trade over long distances required specialized traders who were occupied solely with transporting goods and bartering them with the distant customers. They tended to follow familiar paths from one locality to the next, so trade routes developed. People who lived on them could count on getting imported trade goods regularly. A village market might develop into long-distance trade market if it lay on an important trade route. People would be expected to live there, and the village become a town, as the market officials to allot pitches, hear complaints, and keep order. It also provided wealth for the ruler who provides levy duties on the marketplace. In a previous presentation that I did about the Sahara, remember, and in the Windows of West Africa, I showed you trade routes. This kind of hits, well, doesn't kind of, this speaks to that. This particular slide speaks to that. And if you can remember, or if you go back and look at either one of those particular presentations and you see the trade route maps pop up, that's why. In the village community, every able-bodied person farmed. Let me repeat that. In the village community, every able-bodied person farmed. In the market town, occupations could be more specialized. In the Yoruba cities, for instance, there were many who did not farm. The Oba and his court, the market officials, and the import-export traders. Let me pause right there. Remember, we just saw a slide in a community where people were all working. You had the old all the way down to the younger who were able-bodied and able to complete the task of making the canoe cloth. This speaks to that. Let me continue. Food had to be provided for them, either brought in from surrounding villages or grown by townspeople who went out daily to their farms. This swelled the volume of goods sold in the market, for food would be sold there as well as import commodities. Nevertheless, apart from the long-distance traders, there was no real trading class. As in the villages, the markets were carried on largely by women for whom it was part-time occupation, though vital to the community. Nor in the subsistence economy of West Africa were farmers able to grow food for exports beyond their own locality, but each community grew the basic food to supply itself. If you go back and you look at the ancient history of what a community meant, you would have neighbors not all growing the same type of vegetables. You would have one that could grow tomatoes, one that would grow, I'm just giving examples, greens, another one that would do onions, and another one that would do cabbage, or who would domesticate the cow, pig, whatever. And each able-bodied person in this particular village or community would basically barter. And since each one of them had something different to offer the other, it all ended up equaling out amongst each other. West African gold. Now, every time you think about Africa, or you talk about specifically West Africa, the conversation always gears toward gold. There's a reason for that. Are the stories of Mansa Musa true? Was it a huge gold rush in West Africa? Did Prester John really exist? What were the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, and other European nations actually be doing in West Africa in this particular period of time for so long? Then it must be true that there was gold everywhere in West Africa. Rich gold deposits lay across a wide area of the forest belt in the regions of the upper Senegal to the upper Niger and the upper Volta. This gold producing country was known to Arabic and later the European writers as Wangara. The ore could be easily extracted, shafts were sunk, the gold-bearing rocks were hacked out and crushed, and gold was washed from them in calabashes by women. It was then exported northwards. As the demand grew, gold mining became a large industry. Professor Raymond Money has estimated that once it was fully organized, an average of about 9 tons of gold was exported annually. He mentions for mining machinery and techniques then available, total gold exports from West Africa reached only 21 tons, an amazing tribute to the African miners of the past, working with rudimentary equipment. The gold trade linked the forest belt with the Mediterranean and beyond it to Europe and Asia. Africa gold was in immense demand in Europe during the so-called Middle Ages there, before the mineral wealth of the American continent was known to Europeans. I'm going to repeat that. African gold was in immense demand in Europe during the so-called Middle Ages there, before the mineral wealth of the American continent was known to the Europeans. Europe depended on Africa for its gold supply. Hence, for people in Europe, West Africa was the land of gold, a country glittering with fabulous riches. The gold export from the forest belt went in 2 stages. The first was from the gold-producing regions, through the forest into the open savanna country where the gold was bartered with traders from the Mediterranean shores who had come southward to obtain it. The second was across the desert, where the traders come from the north, carried it in camel loads to the cities of North Africa. There it was either minted into coins for local use or re-exported beyond Africa. Gold was the most important staple in this trade, and until the discovery of America, the Sudan was principally sourced gold both for the Muslim world and for Europe. It is significant that though much was known about the trade in general, little reliable information was available to the Arabs about the gold fields themselves. Common among Arab geographers is a description of gold growing in the Sudan like carrots. The Sudan chiefs and traders tried to keep the sources of gold secret for the foreign North African traders. Indeed, these Sudanese themselves had easy relations with the people of the gold-producing countries. This is well illustrated by the particular method by bartering known as the silent trade. The traders laid down their merchandise, mainly salt, on the bank of the river and retreated. Then the local people came with their gold, laid some of it against each pile of the goods, and withdrew. The traders then came back, and if satisfied with the amount of gold, they took it. As soon as they had dispersed, the local people came back to collect the merchandise they bought with their gold. Remember, salt in one period of time was more important than gold. Now, I'm kind of going in reverse for a particular reason. And I do want to give a shout out to my Mossi warrior brother, Black Panther, because he provided me with this particular video. If anybody's familiar with this particular lake, it is in West Africa. It is a pink salt lake. Here we will have a brother mining salt out of the lake. He can only stand there, as we were told, for a substantial amount of time without any type of protection on. And if he did have protection on, he could only be in there, I think he said, up to 3 hours. And then he would immediately have to get out of the salt water, and then he would have to get cleaned up and taken care of, because being in there too long could do some damage to your skin.
Brother over there is getting the salt from the lake. He says it's very difficult. Whatever, but this is what he product. Rice is kind of easy. I don't know if y'all can actually see the salt.
Now, the video was a short video, and it was enough to illustrate the point that was previously made in the other slide in reference to mining salt. And the same way with gold. These people had tweeted or weaved baskets to mine these things out of, and then they would bring them up out of the water and move forward. Now, we didn't really get to see much of what the brother was doing. We couldn't see much of what the brother was doing because the lake is pink and it's a salt lake. And Ben says there's nothing really living in this particular lake because nothing could survive because of the amount of salt, the volume of salt that would destroy any living mechanism or organism. I'm sorry. Gold and salt were the two principal goods in the trade. But as the trade developed, more goods were added to the list, both for export and import. Among the import goods were horses, cloths of all kinds, copper, silver, beads, glassware, dried dates and figs, and all kinds of manufactured goods. When you speak of West Africa, you are speaking in references to the salt and gold trade. Those were staples for the West African. And, you know, even though they had other things to develop, these two natural resources were a high commodity for long periods of time. Encountering the European via trade. Now, earlier, we had seen a few slides that mentioned the European in them in different periods of time, but not earlier on. So what kind of relationship did we actually have with the European via trade? From the late 15th century onwards, Europeans were trading regularly with the coastal peoples. This completely altered the economic map of West Africa. The coast, instead of being on the periphery, became a center of trade. Intercontinental export trade, hitherto absorbed into the center and then dispersed to the north, was now diverted to a new outlet on the coast in a new pattern of trade networks. In West Africa, relations between Africans and Europeans up to the end of the 18th century were primarily economic. The Europeans did not come as conquerors, but as customers. I'm gonna repeat that again. Originally, Europeans did not come as conquerors, but as customers. The Portuguese came to Africa seeking gold. When in 1415 they drove the Muslim invaders out of Portugal, they then took the offensive, invaded Africa, and captured Ceuta, opposite of Gibraltar. They found Ceuta to be a terminus of the Sahara gold trade and determined to find the source. Hence, their voyage down the coast had double aim, seeking route to the Far East and of reaching the African gold supply. European traders were ready to buy a few other commodities. There was a market for ivory in Europe, but the export of ivory from West Africa never reached anything like the proportions it did in East Africa, perhaps because the human population of West Africa was larger and the elephant population therefore smaller. A few vegetable products were also exported to Europe. Benin pepper and Malguita pepper, for instance, the former from Benin, the latter from the Kru coast, but Oriental peppers were preferred in Europe. And as the European trade with the Far East expanded, the demand for African peppers declined. Remember that pepper was originally exported and then it declined. Textile wovens in Europe or in India and imported to Africa via Europe were the chief import commodity. It is strange that import textiles should have been in such demand in countries with their own traditions of skilled weaving. Nevertheless, more textiles were imported into West Africa at this period than any single commodity. There was a big demand for firearms, recently invented in Europe, though guns and gunpowder were only imported on a large scale in the 17th century. From then on, it became essential for rulers to have regular supplies. By the end of the 18th century, there were factories in England and Birmingham turning out special arms for the African trade, long barrel lead guns, which were often as dangerous to the user as the victim. Other manufactured goods in demand were all kinds of metalware, like cooking pots or brass pans used in salt making, ornaments, beads, bracelets, and mirrors to display them. Distilled spirits as changed from locally made palm wine and tobacco. Tobacco grows in West Africa, but nonetheless, American tobacco was imported in large quantities. I'm gonna repeat that again. We're seeing a trend here since we encountered the European. First, it was the pepper. We had our own pepper. Then it was imported in. Now, tobacco grows in West Africa, but American tobacco was imported in. Things that make you go, With the notable exception of firearms, these goods were luxuries rather than necessities. They merely supplement local manufacturers with imports of superior quality. Some were not even superior. Many imported cotton cloths, for instance, were inferior to the homemade kind for all their gaudy appearance, but as we know, foreign-made goods often have prestige value. Remember that. As manufactured goods were imported increasingly, local industry tended to suffer. Iron mining declined in importance because Europeans imported bars of iron implements. In Benin, however, there was a rare example of import stimulating local productivity. Bronze were imported there from Europe on a large scale, thus enabling sculptors to produce far more works of art, notably the magnificent square bronze plaques used to decorate the walls of the obelisk place. Occasionally, might be protected. Rulers in Sierra Leone coastal area, for instance, in the 18th century prohibited the import of European salt in order to protect their own salt-making industry. But in general, European trade discouraged industry. Hence, in a country where capital formations were in any case difficult, except for Muslims, there was a little in production methods or to increase productivity. The oil from place to place along the coast. In some parts, they built forts to trade from. In the Niger Delta, they traded from ships anchored in the rivers. Elsewhere, they settled singly on groups in towns and villages. The coastal people acted as middlemen between them and the people in the interior and prevented them going inland to trade direct, lest they lose their privileged middleman position. All right, so Europeans initially stayed along and build. This allowed many of the middlemen to broker deals and build relationships that kept the European at bay. On the other parts of the coast where the Europeans settled, the king or the chief of the country constituted himself their protector, or as he called in some places, landlord. The chief collected commission for business dealings that took place along the coast, and he also made sure his money was well protected. In return, he undertook and looked after them, not only protecting them physically and supplying their everyday wants, housing, food, and wives, but representing them in any law cases they might have been involved with, or in any dispute in which their interests were affected. In this way, Europeans were kept out of law courts and prevented from interfering in political affairs of the country. Where they were settled in large numbers, though, as in the Gold Coast forts, it is impossible to prevent them from having some political influence. Now, in the Niger Delta, the trading system was fitted in the social and political organizations of the country. The trading union was the house, originally the extended family of the dominant member, but widened to include all his trading subordinates. European traders did business with the head of the house, giving him goods on credit. In other areas of the European had equal protection in exchange for goods and services. In areas where the Europeans lived under protection of the landlord, they would advance goods to the subjects, who would eventually return the slaves. If they did not return, the trader held his landlord responsible for the debt. Any mishap in the landlord would pay, but would make it up otherwise. So the European could safely give credit, knowing he would not lose in the long run. Thus, there grew up a system of credit trading which has persisted in West Africa long after the end of the slave trade. Now, trade by barter, the simple exchange of one commodity against another, was gradually modified in many parts of the coast. In the Niger Delta Manilas, small copper or brass twisted in half moons were used as currency. Cairo was already mentioned as being used in the mid-Niger cities were also used. In some parts of the coast, the currency system grew up based on iron bars. Goods would be valued in notional bars and traded against one another. For example, so many slaves would be valued at 100 bars, and so many yards of cloth barrels or guns or brass or pots would be valued at 100 bars. Now, the two would then be exchanged without any actual pieces of iron being used at all. The value of commodities and bars varied with supply and demand. If gunpowder was plentiful, it was value and bars fell. Its value and bars fell now. So the system offered plenty of scope for bargaining. Usually the European trader profited, for his African customers did not know what he had paid for his goods in Europe, and he would try to make up his assortment of bars in such a way as to give himself a profit. On the other hand, the African could offer benefit by the system too. In order for the Europeans to trade, they had to pay dues. Usually they paid a sum up front and the rest on the back end. Evidence points to a well-organized trade carried on according to recognized commercial rules with mutual confidence between trading partners, for without confidence, credit could not have been given. It could therefore easily be adopted by people who were long used to trading with one another, so long as they were ready to overlook its moral implications. The entry of the European into West Africa is a chapter filled with turmoil, evil, and mischief. To be quite honest, it was flat out horrific. Before trade moved to currency, bartering was an honest trade. You did not have one taking full advantage of the other in exchange for goods and services. With the introduction of currency, what seemed fair between African business women and men was that fair. However, once Europeans learned that they could negotiate or broker deals with the chiefs along the coast at the disingenuous prices, the European took full advantage of this situation. The missing piece of this presentation lies in the belly of what we know today as the largest kidnapping event in world history. Intentionally not spoken on, especially with the involvement of both the Arab and the European, were merely focused on understanding trade in West Africa. So for many people expecting me to talk about the slave trade or the kidnapping and the involvement in what we call the trade in West Africa, I intentionally left it out for that particular reason. I wanted to deal with the natural resources that were being exchanged at this period of time along the coastline throughout the last 500 or 600 years. Now, before it was bodies, it was an honest trade. Before the European, there was an honest trade. Before the Arab, there was an honest trade. There was no kidnapping or an exchange of goods for a human being at all. People brokered in a peaceful manner, one that we can learn on. And if we take the time to look at this from a different perspective, we actually can grow from it and be able to teach ourselves how to get rid of some of the things that we fear today. Because everybody don't have enough money to do certain things, but some people have a certain skill set that can be beneficial for a community, and therefore that person could come up in the community as well as the other people who have other skill sets that can benefit one another. We've been trying to solve an economic crisis for a long period of time. By looking back in history, this is an opportunity to do so. Hopefully you learned something in this presentation. In conclusion, we can learn a lot about the past 1,000 years, especially as it relates to building or creating something so simple as trade among neighbors. Minus the influence of currency, life can still exist. It once existed and the people made good on the exchange of goods and services across Africa. Currency corrupted trade. Currency created competition where competition didn't exist. Currency created a greed and nearly shifted a we first people to a selfish I first people. Currency created division and created an opportunity for kidnapping event to prosper on such a mass scale as it did, especially during the so-called Age of Discovery. Trade lost its honest intent, but that can be recovered through demonstration by like-minded individuals. Next time you borrow some sugar from your neighbor, remember that once was a way of life. Here are my sources and picture references that were used, with 5 books and 3 picture references. And shout out to Brother Ben again for throwing me that video on the salt mining yesterday. I appreciate that, brother. Now, before we conclude, I do want to let you guys know that next week Kofi Pasai is up. I think he's coming back to back with presentations, and then I will follow the following week. So you will hear from me again in about 2 weeks. And before I play our favorite song in the whole world, Kofi, you got anything you wanna add to it, or you wanna wait till after the video?
Nah, you said pretty much, man. Just continue to family continue to support the Mossi World Clan channel. Yeah, be looking forward for my presentation next week, the Gullah Geechee language presentation, as well as the Louisiana Uprising 1811, and then followed by my Mossi brother, Herit Shawn Khalfani. Again, we appreciate y'all supporting us. Go back and check out the video our Mossi War brother Ben did yesterday, which was an excellent presentation. Again, we just want to thank y'all so much.
Yeah, Madupe family. So don't forget to like this video, share the video with like-minded individuals who it could benefit. Also, shout out to the Amara Squad for cleaning up at the first annual Sonetta TV Awards. They won every category that they were in except for maybe one, which was a tough one to win. And Sister Naya, you know, maybe next year she'll be able to pull that category out and win it wholeheartedly. You know, we just got to continue to get people to get out and vote on that particular spectrum. But she lost to a great dear sister, Dr. Yaya, who is also a great supporter of the Amara Squad and the families. And we, you know, and we support her work as well. Other than that, man, you know, we have a like page on Facebook. Please look it up. It's the Mossi Warrior Clan like page. We drop a lot of information there every day, sometimes all day. Other days, you know, a few things here and there, but it is useful information that you could actually learn from. Like I said, we're going to continue, like Kofi said, I'm sorry, that we're going to continue to bust you upside your head with this information, and that's what we set out to do. So this will conclude the presentation. Like I said, for those people who could learn something from this, maybe you'll go back and rewatch it. Other than that, man, the flags fly high. Madupe, everybody, for tuning in.
For the unity and the redemption of the African world.
Salute them honorable Marcus.
We are not ready to listen then.
They might not have been ready then.
As Buster Weather, we are ready.
Ain't no doubt about it.
To listen.
We ready, baby.
Now.
Let's go. Yeah.
Flag fly high. Flag fly high. Flag fly high.
Black kiss in the sky, breaking side to side. The flag fly high. Come on.
Flag fly high. Flag fly high. Flag fly high.
All these G's on the rise, all eyes will recognize the flag fly high. Hold it high, let it fly. Rebel colors forever, Garvey would never die. Overnight, the throne ready, let's take a ride. Cats won't fix, men don't choose a side. This is the path for the warriors. Some travel, yet still Pandorians. Black power represents us. You either roll with Africa or against us.
Flag fly high. Flag fly high. Flag fly high.
Black fists in the sky, breaking side to side. It's the flag fly high.
Flag fly high. Flag fly high. Flag fly high.
All these G's on the rise, all eyes will recognize the flag fly high. The red is for the blood. I got the best stock. The rest got stood. The black is for the gods, melanated the elevator, holding the main charge. The green is for the cradle. Africa, everything first, the earth's navel. His excellency put it together as a symbol of liberation. That's how we get the manners, RBG.
Flag fly high. Flag fly high. Flag fly high.
Black fists in the sky, breaking side to side. It's the flag fly high. Come on.
Flag fly high. Flag fly high. Flag fly high.
All these G's on the rise, all eyes will recognize the flag fly high. The blind minds is 99. People on it in no time. I'm the drab on my design. We won't ready. Hard line. Ain't no games with that red flame. Triple stage of that black band. Revolution in my veins. Till we free, I won't change. And you can count on that like an abacus. Celebrate the victories and the challenges. It's deeper than social media statuses. This lifestyle, motivation flag fly high. That red, 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 black, 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 green, green, green. RBG, I'm about that red, 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 black, 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 green, green, green. That RBG, I'm about that red, 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 that black, 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 that green, green, green. RBG, I'm about that red, 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 black, 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 green, green, green. That RBG, baby. RBG, baby. Come on. Fly high, a flag, fly high, a flag, fly high. Shout out to all my RBGs worldwide. Doing this thing garbage style, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Flag, fly high.